So here's the question this video is asking, and it's not a simple question. I want to be upfront about that right now. This isn't who was the worst person ever, because that framing is cheap and it's not the point. The point is this: why do we have hundreds of documentaries, thousands of books, films, a whole cinematic universe of Nazi content, while Mao Zedong, responsible for somewhere between 45 and 78 million deaths, barely registers in a Western schoolroom? Why does a man who killed 10 million people in the Congo, King Leopold II, still have statues standing, still get called a visionary hero by European politicians as recently as 2010? Why does a man who presided over a famine that killed 2 to 3 million people, Churchill, remain the most romanticized wartime leader in the English-speaking world? And why does Pol Pot, who killed somewhere between 1.7 and 2.5 million people in just 4 years, representing up to a third of Cambodia's entire population, barely make it onto a high school curriculum? The answer, when you start pulling on that thread, is not comfortable. It involves geography, it involves race, it involves who gets to write history, it involves Hollywood, Cold War politics, journalism, photography, and something deeply embedded in the psychology of Western civilization. This is a 4-part deep dive. We're going to spend serious time with each of these figures. Not to rank them, not to diminish what Hitler did, but to genuinely understand why some monsters become immortal in our imagination, while others dissolve into footnotes. By the end of this video, I think you'll look at history and the way it gets told very differently. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel and make sure to leave a comment telling us which truth you will love to hear. Let's move forward. In Brussels, for decades, there stood statues of a man who presided over one of the most grotesque systems of organized human suffering ever devised. Not war, not conquest in the heat of battle, a deliberate, bureaucratically managed machine of terror designed to extract rubber from a jungle the size of Western Europe, and powered entirely by the bodies of people he treated as livestock. His name was Leopold II. He was King of Belgium. He wore a top hat and grew a magnificent beard. He was received in European courts. He gave speeches about humanitarian missions in Africa. He called himself the protector of the Congolese people. And under his personal ownership, not Belgium's, his personal ownership of the Congo Free State, somewhere between 10 and 15 million people died. Let's be precise about what that means. When Leopold claimed the Congo at the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, he did something remarkable. He convinced the entire colonial world that he was doing Africa a favor. He spoke about ending the Arab slave trade. He invoked the language of civilization and Christianity. He set up a front organization, the International African Society, to make himself look like a philanthropist, and the world nodded and handed him a territory 76 times the size of Belgium. The Congo was rich, ivory first, then rubber, because in the 1890s rubber became the oil of its era. Bicycle tires, then automobile tires, then industrial equipment. Europe needed rubber desperately, and the Congo had it. Miles and miles of rubber vines threading through the jungle like veins in a body. Leopold's solution to labor costs was simple. There would be no wages. Every village in the Congo was assigned a rubber quota. Meet the quota or face the consequences. The consequences were administered by the force of Leopold's private army, commanded mostly by European officers and staffed by African soldiers forcibly recruited from across the continent. If a village fell short of its rubber quota, soldiers arrived. They took hostages, usually women and children, and held them until the men came back with enough rubber. If the men couldn't produce enough, they were beaten with the shikot, a whip made from sun-dried hippopotamus hide, razor-edged, that could cut to the bone. More than 25 strokes could cause unconsciousness. 100 strokes was a death sentence. And then there were the hands. This is the part that even hardened historians pause at, because Leopold's soldiers were given ammunition with the understanding that every bullet must be accounted for. They were expensive, imported from Europe. Proof of use was required, a severed hand for every bullet fired. This was accounting. This was paperwork. Baskets of severed hands delivered to colonial administrators as receipts. But here's where it spiraled into something almost beyond human comprehension. Soldiers who missed their shot, or who used a bullet to hunt game for food, or who simply didn't want to fire at all, they still needed to produce a hand, so they cut hands from living people, children, old men, women standing in their doorways. A Belgian missionary named Stanislas Lefranc witnessed children being flogged in the streets of Leopoldville for laughing in the presence of a white man. He documented it. He wrote it down. Another account from a force publique officer described being ordered to cut the heads of men and hang them on village palisades, and to hang women and children in the form of a cross. These weren't isolated incidents. This was the system. This was policy administered from Brussels, sanctioned by a king who never once set foot in the Congo he owned like a garden. The man who first exposed this, in what historians now recognize as one of the earliest human rights campaigns in modern history, was a shipping clerk named Edmund Morel. In 1900, working for a company with a Congo shipping contract, Morel noticed something. Ships going to the Congo were loaded with guns, ammunition, and chains. Ships coming back were loaded with rubber and ivory. There were no commercial goods going in, no payment of any kind. The arithmetic was unmistakable. What he was looking at was not trade. It was plunder. It was slavery. It was a death machine. Morel quit his job. He became a full-time journalist and campaigner. He published a book, Red Rubber, in 1906. He found allies. Roger Casement, the Irish-British consul, whose 1904 report to the British government documented the atrocities in clinical, devastating detail. He found the first photographs taken by missionaries like Alice Seeley Harris of children whose hands had been cut off, sitting beside the hands of their dead parents, arranged on the ground like a still life. The photographs went around the world. The campaign built Arthur Conan Doyle. The man who created Sherlock Holmes wrote a book about the Congo atrocities. Mark Twain wrote a furious satire. International pressure mounted. In 1908, Belgium took the Congo away from Leopold. 1 year later, Leopold died in his bed, fabulously wealthy, having spent his Congo fortune building grand public works in Belgium. He was never tried. He was never imprisoned. He was never even formally censured in a way that cost him anything significant. Statues of him stood for over a century. In 2010, a Belgian politician called him a visionary hero. The Congo Reform Association, one of the first international human rights movements in history, successfully exposed him, yes. But what happened after? The story went quiet. The Congo became a Belgian colony and continued to suffer. And Leopold II faded into the background of European history, remembered mainly by specialists, while the continent he terrorized moved on. The death toll of 10 to 15 million, a number that in absolute terms rivals or exceeds what happened in the Holocaust, never became the defining moral horror of the modern world. Why? We'll come back to that, because the answer ties everything in this video together. Joseph Stalin was not dramatic. That's the thing people don't quite appreciate about him. Hitler was theatrical. He screamed, he gestured wildly. He built a mythology around himself. The artist, the visionary, the man destiny had chosen. His evil had a kind of insane grandeur to it. Stalin was an administrator. He had a low, quiet voice. He smoked a pipe. He sat at a desk and signed papers. He rewrote history in textbooks, while the people whose names he removed from those textbooks were being worked to death in camps north of the Arctic Circle. He was, in the most clinical and terrifying sense, a manager of mass murder. The numbers historians ascribe to Stalin are staggering in their scale. R.J. Rummel, who spent decades compiling what he called democide statistics, government-caused deaths, estimated that the Soviet state under Stalin killed approximately 43 million people. More conservative estimates still put the figure at 6 to 20 million direct deaths in the Gulag system alone, with the full accounting including deliberately engineered famines mass deportations and political executions pushing the total far higher. To understand Stalin, you have to understand where he came from, because his story is, in a strange way, the story of what happens when someone who grew up with nothing gets their hands on everything. Joseph Vissarionovich Djougashvili was born in 1878 in Gori, a small town in Georgia, then part of the Russian Empire. His father was a cobbler, a violent drunk who beat him regularly. His mother was a washerwoman who scraped together money to give him a church education, hoping he'd become a priest. He didn't. He found Marx instead. By his 20s, he was a full-time revolutionary, robbing banks for the Bolshevik cause, organizing strikes, being arrested, escaping from Siberian exile with such regularity that it became almost a joke. He was compact, pockmarked from childhood smallpox with a withered left arm from a cart accident. He renamed himself Stalin, Man of Steel, and he became indispensable to Lenin as a fixer, a doer, a man who got things done without asking too many philosophical questions about whether they should be done. When Lenin died in 1924, the expectation was that Leon Trotsky, brilliant, eloquent, internationally famous, would take power. Stalin was considered a secondary figure, an administrator. What nobody understood was that in a Bolshevik state, the administrator controlled everything: party membership, appointments, assignments. By the time the other Bolsheviks understood what was happening, it was too late. Stalin had maneuvered them all into positions where he held the knife. Trotsky was expelled from the party, then the country, then hunted to Mexico, where in 1941 of Stalin's agents buried an ice axe in his skull. What followed was one of the most extraordinary and most underreported episodes of mass killing in human history. The collectivization of Soviet agriculture, launched in 1929 to 1933, deliberately destroyed the peasant class by forcing all farms into collective ownership. The result was catastrophic food shortages. In Ukraine, the breadbasket of the Soviet Empire, the famine was so severe and so clearly engineered. Grain was being exported abroad even as people starved. Ukrainian peasants were forbidden from leaving their villages to find food. Seed grain was confiscated. That historians call it the Holodomor, death by hunger. Somewhere between 3.5 and 7.5 million Ukrainians died in that famine alone. And the debate about whether it constitutes genocide continues to this day, though many countries have formally recognized it as one. Then came the Great Purge of 1936 to 1938. Stalin, consumed by paranoia about enemies within the party and the military, unleashed a wave of executions and imprisonment that consumed his own most loyal supporters. Marshals who had won battles for him, generals who had served since the revolution, old Bolsheviks who had known Lenin personally, writers, scientists, engineers. The director of the secret police, Genrikh Yagoda, who had run the purge machinery, was eventually arrested and shot, murdered by the very system he had built. His replacement, Nikolai Yezhov, who ran the peak of the terror, was also arrested and shot. Stalin was purging the purgers. The Gulag, the Glavnoye Upravlenie Lagerai, the chief administration of camps, was already enormous before the purges. But during the late 1930s, it expanded into a vast system of labor camps, stretching from Siberia to Central Asia, from the Arctic to the Kazakh steppe. Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago, one of the greatest and most devastating works of nonfiction ever written, described it as a hidden country within a country, an empire of suffering operating in plain sight. People were arrested for jokes, for telling a friend that Stalin's portrait on the wall made the room feel smaller, for being the relative of someone who had already been arrested. Interrogators worked through quotas. They were required to produce a certain number of confessions per month. Torture was officially authorized. People confessed to impossible conspiracies, to being secret agents of Germany and Japan simultaneously, to sabotaging factories they had never visited, to meeting with Trotsky in cities where Trotsky had never been. During the Second World War, Stalin deported entire ethnic populations. Chechens, Ingush, Crimean Tatars, Volga Germans, Koreans, to Central Asia and Siberia. The conditions of the deportations killed perhaps a third of those transported before they even arrived. These peoples lost their homes, their lands, and their identities in a matter of hours. After the war, the repression continued. The Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee was dissolved. Prominent Jewish cultural figures were arrested. Stalin apparently was planning another wave of purges. When he died in March 1953, his own doctors, who had been arrested on fabricated charges, may have been next. He died of a stroke. His security detail, so terrified of entering his room uninvited, waited hours before checking on him. By then, the damage was done. He lingered for 4 days and died, surrounded by ministers who were simultaneously grieving and quietly relieved. In Russia today, polls consistently show Stalin as one of the most admired figures in national history. In some surveys, he ranks first. The man who killed more Soviet citizens than the entire German military is a national hero. If that doesn't tell you something about the gap between history as experienced and history as received by the wider world, I don't know what does. There's a concept that sounds on the surface almost poetic. Year zero. The idea that you can wipe the slate clean. That history is a disease, and the cure is to begin again from nothing. That cities are corruption, and the jungle is purity. That a pencil on your face means you are an enemy of the people. That wearing glasses means you should be killed. This was the governing philosophy of democratic Kampuchea, the name the Khmer Rouge gave to Cambodia after they seized power on April 17, 1975. And at the center of it, largely unknown to the outside world, was a quiet man named Saloth Sar. You probably know him as Pol Pot. His story starts in the Cambodian countryside, in a farming family with modest means but enough money to give him an education. He was sent to Phnom Penh as a child, then received a scholarship to study in Paris in 1949. Radio electronics, technically. Though he spent most of his time reading Marx and meeting other young Cambodian nationalists who were being radicalized in the coffee shops of the left bank. He came back from France having failed his examinations, but having found his ideology. A version of Marxism filtered through a peculiarly Cambodian nationalism, obsessed with the glory of the ancient Khmer Empire and convinced that Cambodia had been humiliated by colonialism, by Vietnam, by the corrupting influence of modernity. He spent the next decade building an underground communist movement, quiet, methodical, trusted. Nobody who knew him in those years describes him as frightening. Colleagues remember a mild-mannered man with a gentle smile, a school teacher by day, at a private school in Phnom Penh, a revolutionary by night. And then things accelerated. The Vietnam War destabilized Cambodia. The United States, trying to cut off North Vietnamese supply lines, began secretly bombing Cambodia in 1969, eventually dropping 500,000 tons of bombs on the Cambodian countryside between 1969 and 1973. The bombing killed tens of thousands of Cambodian civilians and destroyed entire rural communities. And with each bomb that fell, the Khmer Rouge gained new recruits from the survivors, furious, traumatized young men and women who had seen their villages reduced to craters. In 1970, a U.S.-backed military coup deposed Prince Sihanouk. Civil war erupted. By 1975, the Khmer Rouge were winning. On April 17th, their black uniformed soldiers marched into Phnom Penh. What happened next was one of the most radical social experiments in human history, and one of the most lethal. Within days of taking the capital, the Khmer Rouge ordered the evacuation of every city in Cambodia. Every one. Phnom Penh had a population of around 2 million people. Evacuated in hours. Hospitals were emptied. Patients on operating tables were wheeled into the streets. People who had lived in Phnom Penh their whole lives were told to leave everything and walk into the countryside. They were told it would be for 3 days. Many of them never came back. Money was abolished. Banks were emptied and blown up. Schools were shuttered. Temples were desecrated. religion was banned, the calendar was reset to year one. Entire population became agricultural laborers. They lived in work camps in the jungle and the rice paddies, working 18-hour days on starvation rations. The Khmer Rouge divided people into categories: base people, peasants who had supported the revolution, and new people. Anyone who had lived in a city, held a professional job, worn glasses, spoken a foreign language, or in any way been touched by modernity. New people were expendable. The targets for execution were almost surreal in their breadth: doctors, lawyers, teachers, anyone who had worked for the previous government, Buddhists, monks, Christians, Muslims. The Cham Muslim minority lost an estimated 70% of their total population. Vietnamese Cambodians, Chinese Cambodians, people who were too educated, people who looked educated. The wearing of glasses became a potential death sentence on the theory that it suggested literacy. The infamous Est-21 prison, a former high school in Phnom Penh, processed thousands of prisoners who were tortured into confessing to whatever the interrogators required, then trucked to the killing fields at Chorung Ek, where they were executed, often with farming tools rather than bullets, because bullets cost money. Of the approximately 17,000 people who entered S-21 between 1975 and 1979, somewhere between 7 and 12 survived. In 4 years, the Khmer Rouge killed between 1.5 and 2.5 million people. In a country of roughly 7.8 million, that is a proportion of national population murdered that has no parallel in the 20th century. Not the Holocaust, not Stalin, not Mao. In percentage terms, Pol Pot killed more of his own people than any other regime in the modern era. He was overthrown in January 1979 by a Vietnamese invasion. The Vietnamese, themselves a communist state, having been attacked repeatedly by the paranoid Khmer Rouge. The irony is almost too much. Communists saving people from other communists. Pol Pot retreated to the jungle near the Thai border and spent the next 2 decades running a guerrilla insurgency. He was never tried in an international court during his lifetime. He died in 1998 under house arrest by his own followers of apparent heart failure. Though many suspect it was suicide, he was cremated before any autopsy could be performed. In 2010, the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia began their work. Decades late, most of the defendants, elderly or already dead. The world had moved on. Mao Zedong is the most difficult figure in this story to reckon with, not because his crimes are in any doubt, they are not, but because his legacy is so entangled with one of the most consequential political experiments in human history that separating the man from the nation he created is genuinely complicated. China exists in the shape it does today, a unified, industrialized world power, partly because of Mao. It also exists with somewhere between 45 and 78 million people missing from it, depending on whose accounting you accept. He was born in 1893 in a rural village in Hunan province, the son of a relatively prosperous peasant farmer. His father was strict to the point of cruelty. His relationship with that fact, the angry son of a controlling father, wound its way, some historians argue, through everything he ever did. He was a voracious reader from childhood. He devoured Chinese classical history, then discovered Marxism in his 20s through the new intellectual circles forming in Beijing. He was one of the founding members of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921. He spent the next 28 years in almost constant movement, fighting warlords, fighting the Japanese, fighting Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists in a civil war that consumed China for decades. The Long March of 1934 to 1935, when the Red Army, encircled and near destroyed, retreated 6,000 miles on foot through some of the most brutal terrain on Earth, became the founding myth of communist China. Mao led it. He emerged from it as the undisputed leader of the Chinese Communist movement. In 1949, after the final defeat of the nationalists, he stood in Tiananmen Square and announced the founding of the People's Republic of China. His first years in power were bloody but comprehensible in the context of revolution. Landlords were killed. Estimates range from 1 to 2 million. Political opponents were executed or imprisoned. A thought reform campaign forced citizens to denounce their neighbors, their colleagues, their relatives. Between 1950 and 1953, the Korean War killed Chinese soldiers by the hundreds of thousands. But the defining catastrophe of Mao's rule was the Great Leap Forward, launched in 1958. The idea was audacious, almost delusional in its confidence. China would industrialize in years rather than decades. Peasants would smelt steel in backyard furnaces, while simultaneously collectivizing agriculture into enormous people's communes. China would surpass Britain in industrial output within 15 years. What actually happened was one of the greatest man-made famines in human history. The collectivization of agriculture destroyed the incentive structure that kept farms productive. Grain was confiscated and exported abroad to demonstrate the revolution's success even as people began to starve. Local officials, terrified of reporting failure, lied about harvest figures, sending more grain upward than actually existed. Scientists who pointed out that the new agricultural techniques, including planting seeds so close together they killed each other, were counterproductive, were denounced as rightists and silenced or jailed. By 1959, people were dying in the tens of millions. Mao was warned. In July 1959, his defense minister, Peng Dehuai, wrote him a private letter outlining the catastrophe. Mao had Peng arrested and purged. He told his ministers to keep the communes running. The famine deepened. No independent historian doubts that somewhere between 15 and 55 million people died in the Great Leap Forward. The range is enormous because records were falsified, destroyed, or never kept. The most widely accepted scholarly estimate is around 30 to 45 million deaths between 1959 and 1962 in 3 years during peacetime, in a country that was, at that moment, receiving international recognition and diplomatic engagement from much of the world. Then, before China had properly recovered, came the Cultural Revolution, launched in 1966. Mao, sensing that his power within the party was slipping, turned to the youth. He mobilized millions of young Red Guards, teenagers, and young adults to attack the four old customs, old culture, old habits, old ideas. What followed was a decade of chaos. Schools were shut, universities closed, intellectuals were beaten, humiliated, sent to re-education through manual labor. Temples, libraries, and cultural institutions were ransacked and destroyed. People with any education, any foreign connection, any class background that wasn't peasant or worker were fair game. By Mao's death in 1976, somewhere between 500,000 and 2 million people had died in the Cultural Revolution. Tens of millions more had been imprisoned, tortured, or had their lives permanently destroyed. Mao died on September 9, 1976. He was 82, his body wrecked by Parkinson's disease and a long decline. The Gang of Four, including his wife Jiang Qing, were arrested weeks later. The revolution began slowly, carefully to dismantle itself. Today, the Chinese Communist Party officially says Mao was 70% correct and 30% wrong. His face is still on every Chinese banknote. His portrait still hangs over Tiananmen Gate. His mausoleum sits in the center of Beijing, where his preserved body lies in a crystal sarcophagus, and citizens line up to file past it. The Great Leap Forward famine, which killed more people than both world wars combined in many estimates, is barely taught in Chinese schools. Outside China, it's barely known. Now we come to the entry on this list that will make some people, particularly British and American viewers, the most uncomfortable. I want to be precise about this. The history here is contested. Unlike Leopold's Congo or the Khmer Rouge, where the evidence for deliberate policy is overwhelming, Churchill's role in the Bengal famine of 1943 sits at the intersection of wartime decision-making, colonial racism, bureaucratic dysfunction, and genuine historical disagreement. I'm going to give you the full picture and the accusation and the defense, because this story deserves that complexity. In 1943, between 2 and 3 million people died in Bengal, the northeast region of British-controlled India, in a famine. They died on the streets of Calcutta. They died in villages. They died in the worst way human beings can die, slowly from hunger, while food existed in the world. India exported more than 70,000 tons of rice between January and July 1943. As the famine set in, the arguments against Churchill are substantial. A 2019 study by researchers at the Indian Institute of Technology found that the 1943 famine was the only major Indian famine in modern history, not linked to drought or crop failure. Rain levels in Bengal in 1943 were actually above average. The famine, the study concluded, was completely because of policy failure. The specific policies in question, Churchill's war cabinet prioritized food distribution to the military and European stockpiles. Grain import restrictions were in place. When the Secretary of State for India, Leo Amery, told Churchill that people were dying by the millions in Bengal, Churchill's documented response, recorded in cabinet papers and diary entries, was to ask how Gandhi was still alive if the shortages were so bad, and to describe Indians as a beastly people with a beastly religion who were breeding like rabbits. There is also the documented instruction that only Indians directly contributing to the war effort needed to be fed. When food relief was finally dispatched in meaningful quantities, it came late, after hundreds of thousands were already dead. Churchill's defenders make several points that deserve to be heard. The Japanese had captured Burma, cutting off a major source of rice imports. Japanese submarines were patrolling the Bay of Bengal, making shipping extraordinarily dangerous. Churchill was simultaneously managing the most catastrophic war in human history at a moment when Britain itself was rationing food. When the War Cabinet finally grasped the scale of the famine in late 1943, Churchill did authorize food shipments. Eventually, over 1 million tons of grain arrived. Andrew Roberts, one of Churchill's most respected biographers, argues that Churchill did all he could given the wartime constraints. Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen, the world's foremost authority on famine, has argued that the famine was not primarily about food shortage, but about distribution and purchasing power failures. But here's what nobody serious disputes. Churchill held deep racial contempt for Indians, documented in his own words. He sat at the top of a system that was managing India's food supply during a crisis, and 3 million people died. Whether that constitutes deliberate genocide, negligent manslaughter, or tragic collateral damage in wartime, reasonable historians argue all three positions. What is not in dispute is that Churchill's India policy was shaped by a worldview in which Indian lives were worth less than European ones. His own ministers documented him saying so. And yet, Churchill remains the greatest Briton of the 20th century in popular estimation. His face is on merchandise. His quotes decorate motivational posters. Films celebrate his bulldog defiance. He won a Nobel Prize, for literature admittedly, but still. The Bengal famine is not a footnote in most Churchill biographies. It is not taught in British schools. It is not something the average British citizen knows about. And the reason for that gets us to what we've been building toward for this entire video. Alright, we've sat with 5 other figures, we've looked at the body counts, we've traced the histories, we've established that by almost any quantitative measure, Hitler, with somewhere between 11 and 21 million direct murders, the Holocaust plus the broader Nazi killing programs, not counting combat deaths, is not the largest killer in modern history. So why is he the face of evil? The answer is not simple. It's actually a tangle of several distinct factors that reinforce each other, and you have to understand all of them to get the full picture. The most obvious answer, and the most honest one, is this. The Holocaust happened in Europe. It happened to Europeans, many of them educated, assimilated, middle class. It happened in countries that the West considered civilized. It happened in Germany, a country that had given the world Beethoven, Goethe, and Kant. Leopold's Congo was in Africa, And in the late 19th century, the suffering of Africans was simply not considered by the Western world to be the same category of tragedy as the suffering of white Europeans. The Congo atrocities were exposed and the reform campaign was remarkable, but it faded. The moral urgency didn't persist. The world's attention moved on, and a significant part of why that was possible, and why it remains possible to this day, is that the victims were black Africans in a time and a world where black African lives were systematically devalued by the dominant global culture. The Bengal famine killed 2 to 3 million South Asians under a system explicitly premised on the idea that Indian lives were secondary to European military needs. The same logic applied. Mao's victims were Chinese, Stalin's were Soviet, Pol Pot's were Cambodian. These were, in the eyes of the Western cultural and media establishment, distant, foreign, other. The Holocaust happened to Jews, who were European. Many of them were German. They spoke German, wrote in German, composed music in the German tradition. Anne Frank kept a diary in the literary style of a thoughtful European teenager. She loved Peter Pan. She had opinions about Greta Garbo. Proximity matters. Not because it should, but because it does. The Nazi killing machine was one of the most extensively documented enterprises of mass murder in history. This was paradoxically partly deliberate. The Nazis kept meticulous records because they were bureaucrats, because record-keeping was part of the German administrative culture they had inherited and perverted. Transport lists, registration numbers, correspondence between camp administrators, conference minutes from Wannsee, Goebbels' detailed diary, Hitler's table talk, the paperwork of genocide preserved in extraordinary detail. When Allied forces liberated the camps in 1945, they found not just the dead and the dying, but the records. American and British soldiers, many of them young men who had grown up in ordinary towns and had never encountered anything remotely like this, walked into Buchenwald and Dachau and Bergen-Belsen and stood in front of it. General Eisenhower, understanding that this was a moment history could not be allowed to forget or deny, ordered the camps photographed and documented exhaustively. He brought journalists and members of Congress to see for themselves. The images went around the world. They ran on the front pages of newspapers in New York and London and Paris. They were shown in newsreels and cinemas. People who had never heard of Auschwitz saw the images of what had happened there. The Congo's dead were photographed too, those extraordinary missionary photographs of children with stumped arms. But they circulated in a different world, a different media landscape with a different level of reach. Mao's famine was photographed, but China was closed to foreign journalists at the time, and most images didn't emerge until decades later. Stalin's Gulags were described in brutal detail by survivors, but those accounts were disputed, dismissed, minimized. The Holocaust had the archives. The Holocaust had the photographs. The Holocaust had the survivors, and crucially, those survivors were in Europe and America, part of communities with voices in the Western media. After the Second World War, the Allied powers did something that had never been done before in human history. They put the leaders of a defeated nation on trial for their crimes. The Nuremberg trials ran from November 1945 to October 1946. They were extensively reported. They defined new legal concepts: crimes against humanity, crimes against peace, genocide. They established that "I was following orders" was not a defense. Nuremberg created a framework for thinking about Hitler's crimes. It gave them names. It established their scope in a court of law, with evidence, with witnesses, with verdicts and sentences. No equivalent process was ever applied to the Belgian Congo. Leopold died rich and untried. No equivalent process was applied to Stalin, who died in power. None was applied to Mao, who was never defeated. Pol Pot was never tried in an international court. Churchill was never accused of anything in a formal legal sense, and many of the policies that caused the Bengal famine were carried out by a system too diffuse and too complex to locate in a single defendant's dock. The legal articulation of Hitler's crimes made them legible in a way that other atrocities were not. They had been named, categorized, and judged by the formal machinery of civilization. Let's be direct. The entertainment industry turned Hitler into a villain in a way that no other figure in history has been turned into a villain. This happened partly by accident, partly by design, and partly because of something deeper and stranger than either. By accident, after the war, Hollywood needed antagonists. The Cold War produced some, but nuclear-armed Soviets couldn't really be shown as cartoonishly evil without diplomatic complications. The Nazis, however, defeated, their state dissolved, their leaders hanged, were available. They were the perfect villains. Visually distinctive uniforms, instantly recognizable iconography, thoroughly discredited ideology. Hollywood used them constantly. The Nazis became the default movie bad guys of the 20th century. By design, the Jewish community in America, devastated by the Holocaust, kept the memory alive with a fierce moral urgency that is completely understandable and wholly right. Holocaust education became institutionalized. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum opened in Washington, D.C. in 1993, steps from the National Mall, alongside the monuments to Lincoln and Jefferson. The Shoah Foundation was established by Steven Spielberg after Schindler's List, which won 7 Academy Awards in 1994, to record the testimonies of survivors. There is no Cambodian Genocide Memorial on the National Mall. There is no Great Leap Forward Museum. There is no Leopold's Congo Foundation funded by Hollywood. And something deeper. As scholar after scholar has noted, Hitler serves a psychological function in Western culture that goes beyond mere history. He is the monster at the boundary of what we consider human. He is the proof that evil is real, absolute, and embodied. In a culture that struggles with moral relativism, he's the one figure everybody agrees on. You cannot debate whether Hitler was bad. He is the floor. This function, the definitive villain, requires him to remain singular. If we were to admit that Mao killed more people or that Leopold systematically amputated the hands of children for rubber quotas on an industrial scale, the singularity collapses. And perhaps we don't want it to collapse because we need Hitler to be uniquely monstrous. We need him to be the exception. If he is not the exception, if human beings are capable of this under certain conditions in many places, in many centuries, wearing many different kinds of uniforms, then the implications are considerably more uncomfortable. Here's the factor that nobody in official history likes to say out loud. During the Cold War, the West needed allies, and some of those allies were regimes that had done terrible things, or were in the process of doing terrible things. Stalin was the West's ally during World War II. He was Uncle Joe in American propaganda, acknowledging the full scale of his crimes. The Holodomor, the Gulag, the mass deportations was inconvenient during the war and immediately after it, when many Western intellectuals were sympathetic to the Soviet experiment. China under Mao was diplomatically complicated in a different way. After 1971, when Nixon opened relations with Beijing, the political incentive to criticize Mao's record was actively suppressed. China was a necessary counterbalance to Soviet power. American and European diplomats sat across tables from Mao and Deng Xiaoping and chose not to mention the 40 million people who had died in the Great Leap Forward. The Chinese government controlled access, controlled the narrative, and maintained that those numbers were exaggerated. Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge, absurdly, received international recognition and diplomatic support, including from the United States, after they were overthrown by Vietnam, because Vietnam was a Soviet ally and the Khmer Rouge were a useful irritant. The UN seat for Cambodia was held by Khmer Rouge representatives until 1993. The world knew what they had done and looked away. Churchill was the architect of Allied victory in Europe. To hold him fully accountable for the Bengal famine was, for Britain and its cultural sphere, politically and psychologically impossible for decades. He saved Europe from Hitler. That fact colonized every other fact about him. So why Hitler? Because his victims were European. Because his crimes were documented with extraordinary precision. Because he was defeated, tried, and his crimes given legal names. Because Hollywood needed a permanent villain. Because he attacked the most culturally influential minority group in the Western world, who had the means and the moral urgency to ensure he was never forgotten. Because we need him to be singular, the floor of evil, rather than accept that this capacity exists more broadly in human beings and human systems. Because the victims of Leopold, Mao, Stalin, Pol Pot, and Churchill's famine were black, Chinese, Russian, Cambodian, and Indian. And the world that tells history was, for most of the 20th century, not any of those things. And because acknowledging the others in full, with the same moral weight we give the Holocaust, would require us to ask questions about colonialism, about capitalism, about communism, about the decisions Western governments made during the Cold War, about the food policies of a man who is still sold as the greatest hero of the Second World War. These are not comfortable questions. Hitler dead in his bunker. Asking nothing of us is easier. I want to be precise about something before we close. Nothing in this video is an argument that Hitler's crimes were less than what they were. The Holocaust was a genocide of meticulous, deliberate, ideological murder. The attempt to remove an entire people from the face of the earth, organized with industrial efficiency, the specificity of the intent, the scale of the machinery, the targeting of an entire ethnicity for complete elimination. These features are unique in the 20th century, and they matter. The point is not that Hitler was less evil than we think. The point is that other people were more evil than we know. The point is that 10 million Congolese dead under Leopold deserve to be in that conversation. That 2 to 3 million Bengalis who starved while food was exported deserve to be in that conversation. That 30 to 45 million Chinese who died in a famine Mao was warned about and chose to continue deserve to be in that conversation. That 6 million Ukrainians who died in a famine Stalin deliberately engineered deserve to be in that conversation. That 1 in 4 Cambodians killed by a man who smiled gently and taught school deserve to be in that conversation. Moral seriousness requires that we hold all of these, not instead of Hitler, alongside him. History is not a competition, but it is at every moment a choice about who we choose to remember. And that choice reveals what we actually value and whose lives we believe actually matter. The obsession with Hitler tells us something about the crimes themselves, yes, but it also tells us something about us. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel and make sure to leave a comment telling us which truth you will love to hear.